I had no intention of becoming a writer. When I first started thinking about what I wanted to be when I grew up, I wanted to be an activist. I was interested in women's health, so when I went to graduate school, I went in public health and went to work for Planned Parenthood in Raleigh, North Carolina. The title of the presentation, Not Real But True, comes from one of my favorite writers, Alice Munro. I wasn't always a writer, but I was always a reader. I have loved books. Some of my best friends are the characters in novels. I have friends who claim they will not leave books out when I come to visit because they're afraid that I'll pick them up, start reading, and I won't give them back. When I was about 30, I did start to write, and I set my stories on the West Coast. This is a picture of Mount Tamalpais. My first attempt at a novel was a book set in San Quentin Prison in Marin County. I sent that novel to an agent at William Morris. He took it. He said he would try to sell it to New York publishers. After about 2 days, he was calling me to say that he had Lily Feeney Zanuck on the telephone, that a number of New York editors were interested. I thought, this writing stuff is going to be really easy. I was very excited. Fame and fortune was on its way. He didn't sell the book. I reconsidered and thought perhaps writing was going to be a little more complicated than I had anticipated. I applied to Masters of Fine Arts programs. I got into the University of Iowa Writers Workshop, and I can tell you, my husband stayed here. I went up for two years. It's 4 hours and 15 minutes away, exactly. That's a picture of Flannery O'Connor. She's one of the famous people that attended the workshop. A number of other writers you will have heard of, Jane Smiley, John Irving, T.C. Boyle, and I was very impressed. My classmates were brilliant, and so while I was at Iowa, I decided I was going to be not just a writer, but a serious writer. And I began to write stories that were very heavy on theme. They involved characters in conflict with themselves. And in fact, while I was there, I basically overthought every piece of writing that I did. I started sending it out. When I sent out that overthought writing, what I got back was a lot of rejections. In fact, one novel that I was working at while I was at Iowa was about a scientist involved in facial reconstruction. It was very thematic. I sent it to a New York literary agent 3 times. He read it 3 times before telling me it was not going to work. So what did the editors and agents say to my fiction that I was writing in Iowa? Well, they said that it often meandered. Didn't have a plot. Some of them said it was too quiet, which is another way of saying that nothing really happened. And a number of folks said the story was hidden behind some of the prose. I got so tired of hearing that eventually I just decided to write a story about a guy who leaves town unexpectedly, leaves his girlfriend behind, and then returns 2 years later out of the blue, picks up the telephone, calls her because he wants something from her. And that story was published. That was my first story that was published. It was in a literary magazine called Puerto del Sol, which, like the Missouri Review, is a literary magazine based at a university. It's from New Mexico. And so I was very excited. Again, I'm on my way. I started writing short fiction that sold. I was selling my stories to literary magazines. I was excited. A novel was not going to be far behind. But actually, what was immediately present in my life was the second major project, which was my first child. I got my MFA in May and had my first baby in June. I can tell you it is possible to write with an infant in the house, but sometimes you have to choose between sleep and work. It didn't take long before I had 2 children, and nonetheless I started working on another novel. This novel was called The Extra. It was about a woman who was widowed and went on a sitcom. She's placed at a table in the scene and told to have an imaginary conversation with someone at the table in the background, and she starts telling real stories about her life. That was also sent out by my new literary agent to New York editors. 25 editors read the book. A lot of them expressed interest, and each one of them said the protagonist was too old. She was 63. I often threatened to quit writing, but I never came close until this man was reelected to the office of president. I decided I could not afford to stay in my office any longer working on imaginary stories, and I had to get back to my activist roots and start changing the world. I put aside my stories for a while, and I went back out on the street. I started a nonprofit organization called Into the Blue that was aimed at raising money on the coast for democratic infrastructure in the Midwest, the goal of which was to elect primarily a Democratic president. Well, after we did collectively as a country elected a Democratic president, my husband and I went back to the West Coast. We took a trip to the Pacific Northwest to the San Juan Islands. I had not been writing for a while. We met a friend of ours from college who was living on the island and was in a summer production of The Tempest with one of her daughters. I came home and started writing a novel about a woman in a summer production of The Tempest with two of her daughters. That novel did in fact sell to a New York publisher. Penguin Plume bought the novel and scheduled it for a January 2011 publication date. And you can just enjoy the fireworks. This is that novel. It's called Juno's Daughters. It was published in January, and since it was published, I have not had to do my own laundry or pump my own gas. I'm just kidding. I've had to do all of those things. But what I have enjoyed most is visiting book clubs and listening to people argue about the characters in the novel as if they were real people. This last slide represents two things. One, it's my current novel in progress, which is also set on the San Juan Islands, on Lopez Island, and it's about a brother and sister who are reunited after many, many years after being separated in childhood, and it's called Fly to Me. And it also represents how I feel about writing. It's best done without a net. Thank you very much.